For more than 2 decades, Margaret Hartford was a name that almost nobody I remembered, because the whole world knew only as the Mrs. Robert Sterling. Her life had become an echo of her husband's, an ambitious man who went from being a young lawyer with a dusty office to becoming one of the most influential businessmen in the city. What few knew, or preferred to ignore, was that none of that empire would have existed without her strategic decisions. It was Margaret who hypothesized family properties, who invested every last cent of his inheritance, who called contacts influential of his comfortable childhood to open up to him doors that he alone never could have crossed. However, as Robert rubbed elbows with politicians, celebrities, and financiers on the rise, she left diluting in the perfect wife figure. Always smiling, always elegant, always available to serve a glass of champagne at endless receptions. What began as a gesture of love ended becoming in a prison, invisible, made of silences and renunciations. With the passage of the years, Margaret was getting used to his secondary role, like someone who resigns himself to living in perpetual shadow. It wasn't that he lacking own talents. There was studied history of art. He spoke 3 languages and had a photographic eye that once led to winning contests in his youth. But Robert, with his overwhelming charisma and his hunger for success, he knew how to occupy the whole space. When the press wrote about him, they mentioned her only in passing, as an ornament. His charming wife, the discreet Mrs. Sterling. She accepted those crumbs because he believed that marriage was a shared project and that the shine of one too illuminated the other. In reality, each headline was a cruel reminder that your identity was being erased. For many, Margaret was nothing more than a well-dressed woman who smiled next to a powerful man. And the most painful thing was that, with her time, she, same, began to believe it. The illusion that all of this was shared love began to crack. In small details, almost imperceptible to anyone who was not inside the relationship. Robert started coming home later, always with the excuse for meetings, endless or last-minute business trips. Margaret justified, as it there was done so many times, convincing himself that this sacrifice was part of the price of the success. However, in dinners, I noticed that he spoke less and less about we, and more about I. What was once a joint dream was transformed in a monologue where his voice had no place. Even in the intimacy of your home, Robert seemed to be in another place, always with a phone in the hand, responding emails or messages that I never shared with. She was like living next to a ghost, physically present, but emotionally absent. The drop that would begin to fill the glass was an evening when Margaret hosted a private dinner to celebrate her 20th birthday. She had prepared everything with care, her favorite dress, an impeccable table with the crystal glasses inherited from his grandmother, and a bottle of wine saved for the occasion. Robert arrived 2 hours late, smelling of cologne foreign and an air of annoyance, as if that meeting were an obligation. He barely tried the food, talked about business, answered 2 calls, and finished the evening saying that he was exhausted. Margaret sitting in front of the untouched dishes. He felt for the first time a pang of emptiness so intense that not even could cry. It was in that moment when something began to break inside her, although I still didn't know that true betrayal was brewing silently behind his back. The big event came months later, announced in all the financial and social newspapers of the city. A lavish gala to celebrate Robert Sterling's entry into the exclusive circle of the billionaires. For Margaret, that evening represented the hope that at last, their place would be recognized publicly. It happened days choosing a dress that reflected sobriety and strength, not just beauty. She put on makeup carefully, remembering the advice from her mother. Whenever you feel like the world is going to fall apart, look in the mirror and stand up straight. Dignity is your armor. Seeing herself in her reflection, Margaret felt strangely vulnerable, as if presenting itself that evening was a trial by fire. I had the secret illusion that Robert, in amidst the applause, would name as an essential part of its success. The living room from the hotel where it was held, the gala, was overflowing opulence. Crystal chandeliers hung over the round tables. Glasses clinked with the sound of the conversations, and flashes of the cameras captured every fake smile. Margaret entered holding Hans Robert's arm, but soon noticed something strange. The glances that fell upon her were not of admiration, but of pity or mockery. Her ears captured murmurs, cut short when passed by, as if everyone knew a secret that she still hears escaped. And then they saw Vanessa, the young Robert's assistant, walking through the lounge with insulting confidence, greeting guests as if was the owner from the place. He was wearing a red dress that didn't leave space to the imagination and behaved like a more important hostess than the own wife of the honored. In that moment, Margaret felt as the illusion that there was sustained for so many years was beginning to fall apart. The climax arrived with a suddenness that left everyone silent. Margaret had barely managed to get within a small group of acquaintances when two security guards approached him. They planted opposite. "Madam, you must accompany us," they said with a dry tone that froze the blood of those present. She, confused, tried to ask what had happened, but one of them added bluntly, "They are orders of the Miss Vanessa." Those words, they rumbled like a cannon shot. Robert, a few meters away, kept the fixed view in his glass of wine, without do the slightest gesture to stop that grotesque spectacle. In the blink of an eye, Margaret went from being the elegant wife of the honored to become into an expelled intruder, watched by dozens of pairs of eyes eager for scandal. The echo of the Margaret's heels on the marble of the lounge was the cruelest sound I would remember for years. Outside, the night was cold, wet, and the contrast with the stifling heat of the spotlights and the music. It hit like a slap. He walked a few steps without heading, with the heart hammering him in the chest and a mixture of shame and anger going through it, the skin. For minutes she felt naked, stripped of everything she had believed that it was his place, his dignity, even his name. But in that silence filled with humiliation, something began to awaken. It was an inner voice that I remembered every check signed, every property mortgaged, every sacrifice I had made to lift that empire. What in a start was pain unbearable began to transform in clarity. She was not a discarded victim. She was the true invisible partner. And that revelation ignited a force within her new, dangerous, relentless. Return in your house, still with the wrinkled dress and the runny makeup. Margaret did not allow it cry. He sat down in front of his desk, opened a leather notebook where he had kept notes for years and marked 3 numbers in his phone. It was his direct line advisor, financial. His voice, calm and firm, surprised the man on the other end. He ordered the immediate sale his stake in the company, freeze all the joint accounts, and cancel each of the shared credit cards. "Starting tonight, Robert Sterling will feel what it means to truly lose," she said with a calm that hid a storm. He hung up without waiting for a reply, and for the first time in a lot time, allowed himself to breathe with the feeling of having recovered the control. Then it was up to a cupboard embedded and took out a wooden box that carried more than 20 closed for years. Inside, neatly organized, were all the documents he had kept silent. Loan contracts signed with his name, transfers, banknotes that had saved the company in its early days, mortgages on family properties that had served as collateral. Each piece of paper was a painful reminder of how had been relegated, but now in his hands it was transformed in an arsenal. While was passing by the pages yellowed by the Margaret realized she had waited too long. She wasn't just going to defend herself. She was going to dismantle it piece by piece, the empire that he had erased from his own history. The dawn surprised Robert in half a whirlwind of calls and messages. The first in sounding were those of its partners, alarmed by the sudden fall of the actions and the rumor that something serious was happening in the company accounts. Then, one after another, the most important clients demanded explanations, fearful that the solidity of the Sterling Empire was nothing more than a facade about to collapse. Robert, accustomed to controlling every situation with arrogance and charisma, he felt for the first time that the floor you trembled underfoot. He checked frantically the extracts banking and did not understand as the funds had disappeared from the night at tomorrow. The answer was in your inbox, a mail cold and direct from Margaret, notifying the settlement immediate of your stake. At first, your messages towards she were imperative. "We need talk now. Reverse this before it's too late." By not getting response, turned into desperate pleas. "We can solve this. In private, do not destroy what cost so much to build." But Margaret didn't answer. None. While he was sinking in his own panic, she continued his strategy with precision surgical. Wrote notifications, formal requests addressed to the board of directors, attaching documents proving their financial contributions, which for years had been a complicit silence. It became now in a calculated roar, impossible to ignore. For the first time, the man who had built his image of invulnerability discovered which meant being completely at someone else's mercy, the woman who had betrayed, The meeting extraordinary was celebrated in the company's imposing boardroom, a large room with glass walls from where you could see the financial profile of the city. The directors, they arrived with tense faces, each one carrying in the look the weight of the uncertainty. Robert appeared first, impeccable in his suit, trying to appear in control despite the dark circles that betrayed a night awake. He settled down in the head of the table as always, ready to impose her voice. But when Margaret crossed the door, the air in the room changed immediately. She was not the elegant wife relegated to the shadows of social events. She entered as a shareholder, as an invisible founder, with safe step and a thick folder under the arm. The murmurs died away when she placed the folder on the table with a sharp blow. Then, without raising his voice too much, he began to deploy the documents. Contracts signed with his name, mortgages that had saved the first years of the signature, transfers that demonstrated as his money had been the initial support of the empire. Every page was a test irrefutable. The directors, uncomfortable, exchanged glances of embarrassment upon discovering that the official history had erased a piece essential. Robert tried to intervene, stammering vague explanations, but Margaret interrupted with icy calm. "What I built, I can undo it." The sentence was suspended in the air like a sentence, and in that moment the myth of the untouchable tycoon began to crack in front of everyone. Robert's mask crumbled in a matter of minutes. The directors, who had once laughed at his jokes and celebrated his victories, now they looked with a barely concealed disdain. Some they demanded concrete answers, others they asked his resignation immediate to avoid a scandal still major. Robert, sweating under his tailored suit, tried clinging to the same old narrative, that he was the one architect of the success, that everything he had achieved was the result of his genius. But every word sounded hollow in front of the test that Margaret displayed with precision surgical. The safety that it had defined collapsed. His voice trembled, and his haughty gestures were transformed in desperate slaps. Finally, cornered by the evidence and the pressure of the advice, he had no choice but to present his resignation. The scene was so devastating that even Vanessa, the young assistant who there was accompanied to the top and the betrayal, he stayed paralyzed. Her lips always curved in a superior smile, twisted in a grimace of bewilderment as everything fell apart. Margaret, on the other hand, remained serene. She gathered her documents, closed the folder, and stood up with firm step. While across the room, every glance followed her movements, some of respect, others of fear, all aware that she had changed the rules of the game. He did not come out as a victim, but as the silent architect of a ruin necessary. The days that followed the Roberts' resignation was a whirlwind of headlines in the press and rumors in business circles. However, for Margaret it was not a scandal, but a liberation. She barely signed the papers of the divorce, recovered his maiden name, Hartford. That apparently bureaucratic signature was a gesture loaded with symbolism. It was like tearing off a skin dead that there was worn for more than 2 decades. With that simple act, stopped being Amaas the Mrs. Sterling to once again become Margaret Hartford, a woman with its own voice, free from the shadow that had consumed. I felt that, for the first time in years, I could breathe, without asking permission. With part of her fortune recovered, Margaret began to invest in projects that reflected his true values. He opted for energy startups, renewables, funds for social initiatives, and small businesses led by women who, like her, had been relegated to silence. What some they called a risk unnecessary. For Margaret, it was a new beginning. To build something not to aggrandize another's ego, but to give meaning to your own life. At the same time, he rediscovered his passion forgotten by the photography. He bought a camera professional, wrote a little study in his apartment, and went out to explore the city. Captured scenes that others they overlooked. Old women lonely looking out the window, children running through puddles, women carrying heavy bags at the end of the day. On each face I saw a reflection of your own history of resistance. Margaret's talent was not long in coming and called the attention. A local art gallery was interested in your work and offered to participate in an exhibition collective. His photographs, full of rawness and humanity, stood out among the others. Critics highlighted his ability to capture the dignity in middle of the adversity, to show the beauty in what many considered everyday. Margaret, who for years I had been invisible, suddenly I saw his name, Hartford, printed in posters and catalogues, pronounced with respect for strangers. Every compliment was like a brick in the reconstruction of its identity. Every careful look at his work was a confirmation that he was writing his own history. By little, his agenda began to fill up with invitations, investment conferences sustainable, openings in galleries, meetings with young artists. In each space, Margaret was no longer seen as someone's wife, but as a complete woman, with ideas own and an indisputable talent. That visibility, far from intimidating her, drove him to go further. He transformed a part of his study in a space community, where women who had crossed losses or betrayals could meet, share experiences and learn photography as a way to heal. What started as a personal project ended becoming an emotion small but powerful, a support network that gave voice to those who had been silenced. Was in the framework of an important inauguration where the past crossed again with she. The exhibition, it was titled Women Who Resist, and several of its photographs occupied a central place in the gallery. Margaret arrived, accompanied by colleagues and some of the women from her community circle, dressed with elegance sober that radiated security. The atmosphere was full of lights, murmurs, and wine glasses gently clinking. And then it saw Robert standing in a corner with a wrinkled suit that looked like be too big and an expression aged and it toward unrecognizable. The man who had once been the center of attention was now, it seemed, a dislocated, invisible spectator in the same type of event where I used to shine. The meeting. It was brief but full of tension, almost palpable. Robert tried approach with a nostalgic smile, pronouncing his name as if she wanted to recover a link that no longer existed. Margaret. I'm listening in silence, with a serenity that disarmed more than any reproach. There was no anger in his gaze, neither desire for revenge, only the certainty of having left that chapter behind. With a calm voice, he said he was, well, I had found a path own and was happy away from him. Robert, unable to support him the look, nodded with resignation. It was a brief but definitive moment. While he was loading with the ghosts of her mistakes, she stood tall with the freedom of someone who had recovered the control of your life. Sir. With it, as the months passed, Margaret's transformation became impossible to ignore. His investment firm Sustainable was consolidated in the market, attracting both young investors and organizations, internationals who were looking for a real change in the world of the business. At the same time, his photography exhibitions. They began to tour cities out of the country, turning it in an artistic voice recognized for its authenticity. The surname Hartford, which had reborn from the ashes of the humiliation, was now synonymous with innovation, resilience, and art with purpose. Each step taken reaffirmed that I had not only survived, but that I had blossomed in a way that no one, not even Shisame, I would have imagined. The moment of consecration arrived in a big international gallery. The illuminated sign announced, Hartford, Women Reborn. Margaret observed his name in huge letters while a crowd admired his work. At that moment, he knew he had finally come full circle. That same moment evening received a final message from Vanessa, full of resentment and reproaches. Margaret read it, let rest in the screen for a few seconds, and then it eliminated without responding. I didn't feel anger, nor need to settle accounts. What had begun as a story of humiliation and betrayal had ended in a full rebirth. Already she wasn't the invisible wife of an arrogant tycoon. She was a businesswoman, an artist, and above all, an absolute mistress of herself. Same.